Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today I have two cards that use a more contemporary looking Christmas tree. I'm going to be using this new set from the holiday catalog by Stampin' Up! Called Twinkle Trees. It has a lot of really cool potential possibilities here. I'm also using the Softly Falling Embossing folder as well as my Gansai Tambi watercolors. So I'm going to pull 4 of these different colors out in addition to white. And I'm going to put those off to the side. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this. I'm using Versamark ink and I'm stamping onto 90-pound Strathmore watercolor paper. I'm using my MISTI just in case I have to restamp it. Turns out I didn't have to. So I'm continuing on. I'm going to do 2 of these because one I'm going to white emboss and one I'm going to black emboss. So now I'll get my embossing powder out and I'm going to sprinkle the first one with white and then the second one with the black. Now when I sprinkled this on, it wasn't sticking and I was very curious, like, what is going on? I thought it was my ink, then I thought it was my embossing powder being old or something like that. And then I realized I was putting the black on top of the one that I already put the white embossing powder on. So I went ahead and re-stamped these and I put the white embossing powder on the first one and now I'm putting the black on the second one. And then I'll heat both to set them. So I'm going to be creating both of these cards at the same time in parallel. I'm using a very small brush so that I can be careful to stay within the lines. The white embossing powder can stain with these paints, and that's why I'm going to be careful to stay within the lines. I'm using very little water with these paints, and when you do that, you get more of a thick acrylic application than a watercolor. And this is going to give me really bright, bold colors. Now, if you wanted more of a watercolor look, you could drop some water into each of these areas and then pick up some color, drop it in, and let the water do the work. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep my colors really opaque and vibrant. And I want it to look sort of like a stained glass window. I'm going to speed through the rest of this coloring. Just a little note about the paper I'm using. I'm using Strathmore 90-pound watercolor paper. Whenever I don't need a watercolor paper that's really bright white, then I'll use my Strathmore because it is kind of like an off-white color. I mean, it is white, but it's not exactly a bright white. And so whenever I want bright white, like let's say I'm going to put a watercolor panel on top of white cardstock, so I really want those cardstocks to be the same. Then I'll take my Canson XL mixed media watercolor paper. That's kind of my favorite at the moment. Another really bright watercolor paper is Ranger watercolor paper, but I find that with very little brushing it starts to pill up a lot quicker, and so I really don't use that paper very much. Now I have Strathmore 90-pound and 140-pound. I like to use the 90-pound because it's obviously thinner, and when you start layering your cardstock, it's easier to kind of unwarp and flatten out the 90-pound than it is to flatten out the 140-pound. All right, now that the white Christmas tree is done, I'm going to move on to the black. I'm going to color it with the same exact colors, same amount of water, and the same colors in each segment just to make things consistent. So I'm going to skip over the rest of this coloring because it's the same thing as the white. In fact, this is a little bit easier than the white because you don't have to worry too much about staining the embossing powder, so it goes a lot faster. While those trees dry, I'm going to work on something else. I'm going to actually create some gold stars because I don't have any gold foil paper or glitter paper. So I'm just going to take some Neenah cardstock. I'm going to ink it up with some Versamark ink. I'll sprinkle it with some gold embossing powder and then heat it to set it. And then I'm just going to die cut some stars out of this. There's a really nice star in the Perfect Pine set by Stampin' Up! So I'm going to use that and run that through the Big Shot and create 2 stars, 1 for each card. Next, I'm going to work on the snow for my black cardstock. You can see the type of brush I'm using. It's a flat number 6 brush. I have a glass of water and I'm going to use my white Gansai Tambi watercolor. This is my favorite way to apply splatters because this paint is very thick and can be opaque. So I'm going to dip it into my white paint and wipe off any excess water I have from when I dipped it into the water glass. And I'm just going to tap it on the top of the brush, and you'll notice that as I continue to tap, I'm going to get smaller and smaller dots, and that's because the thick water is going to come out first and then it'll dissipate and I'll get smaller spots. Now when you use this Gansai Tambi for splatters, some of it, well, white on black anyway, some of it is going to kind of fade and absorb into the cardstock, but some of it is not, depending on how thick the droplet is. So because of that, I'm gonna drop quite a bit of this. So I'm gonna continually drop and drop and drop. Another tip is when I first drop, I'm going to drop in the middle of the cardstock where I know I'm going to put that Christmas tree. Because if I'm going to get a big splatter that I don't want, it's going to be the very first one that I tap out. So I start in the middle and then I just work my way around. So I'm going to keep doing this until I get the perfect amount of snow. All right, I'm going to set that off to dry and start working on my sentiments. I'm using this Peace sentiment. I wanted something non-religious, and this was a really cute one. It was just the right size from the Reindeer Christmas set. This is a really super old set by Hero Arts. I'm going to ink it up with some Versamark ink, and then I'm going to stamp it at the top of this piece of black cardstock and at the bottom. So I'm going to create both my sentiments at the same time, and then I can just trim it at the bottom of the sentiment and then at the top of the sentiment. So I'll just sprinkle it with some white embossing powder and heat it to set it. I also need to create my dry emboss panel. This is the Softly Falling Embossing Folder by Stampin' Up. So I'll put some Neenah Solar White cardstock in there and I'll run it through my Big Shot. And you can see when it's finished, it really does look like snow. It's heavy at the top and it kind of scatters as it hits the ground at the bottom. By now my trees are dry, so I'm going to cut them out. They're pretty easy to cut because their lines are really straight. One final step with these trees, I'm going to adhere them to a piece of scratch paper, and I'm going to clear emboss the whole thing. So I'm going to take my Versamark ink, I'm going to cover the whole thing with ink, and this is going to make it look like glass. And then I'm going to sprinkle it with some clear embossing powder. I double checked to make sure I had the right embossing powder. Sometimes I mix up the white and the clear, and then I heat it to set it. And I did this with both the white tree and the black tree. Now it's time to assemble all these pieces together. I used Scotch foam tape on the back of the tree, and I just cut some of the pieces to fit all the angles. And I just used ATG tape runner on the back of the sentiment strip. I laid my elements onto the card so I can get the right amount of space, and then I adhered the sentiment first. And then I peeled the backing off the tree and put that right in the middle, which would be right over the A. Whenever I need a little piece of foam adhesive, I always take my Stampin' Up! Dimensionals and I cut the little circles into whatever size I need. And so one of these little end pieces was perfect for behind this star. So I adhered that to the top of the tree, and then I flipped over the panel and cut off the excess from the sentiment. And then I finally put some ATG tape runner on the back of this panel and adhered it to a Hero Arts black note card. Now I originally cut this panel to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 so that I would have a 1/8 of an inch mat across the whole panel. So that completes the first card. I'm going to show it so you can see how pretty and shiny it looks. And then I'm going to do the second one. I actually cut another strip of Neenah white cardstock. It's about 1 5/8 inches high. And I'm going to adhere this to the bottom of my snow panel. I felt like all that snow was just a little bit too much and it needed a break, and so that's why I added that white piece to the bottom. And then I adhered my sentiment the same way with an ATG tape runner, and then I've got some Scotch foam tape on the back of my tree and a dimensional on the back of the star. And then finally I'll adhere this panel with some ATG tape runner to a Neenah cardstock base. So both of these cards are A2 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch. And so that completes the second card. You can see how shiny it is. And then here are both of the cards together. I hope you enjoyed these two different card versions, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.